There are only 2 countries in Africa that have never been colonized. Today, there are 55 sovereign states in Africa. Before World War II, there were only 2. The rest of the continent was colonized. Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Germany, Italy. These 7 empires ruled almost all of Africa. But how did those 2 escape being colonized? The partition of the continent was formalized in 1884. The Berlin Conference regulated European conquest. Great European powers gathered in Berlin to sign the General Act. Historians consider it the beginning of the scramble for Africa. Of course, colonization had already been going on. By the 1870s, Europeans controlled 10% of Africa. By 1914, when World War I began, they controlled all of it, with 2 exceptions, Ethiopia and Liberia. Ethiopia, formerly Abyssinia, is an ancient country. It was one of the great powers in biblical times. Back then, it was called the Kingdom of Axum. In the 19th century, it was ruled by a succession of emperors. Its location in the Horn of Africa made it too remote for Europeans. The British preferred trade to conquest. In Ethiopia, they did engage in several skirmishes. Each time, the British won. Each time, they left it alone. The Ethiopian Empire was invaded by Egypt in 1876, but prevailed. 20 years later, it was invaded by Italy. Around 15,000 Italians and 10,000 Ethiopians were killed. The war lasted for a little over a year. At the decisive Battle of Adowa, the Italian army was crushed. In 1896, Italy agreed to the Treaty of Addis Ababa. This ended the war and recognized Ethiopia as an independent state. In 1935, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini invaded it again. This time, the Italian annexation succeeded. In 1936, Ethiopia was merged with Eritrea and Italian Somalia. The new territory was known as Italian East Africa, but this was occupation rather than colonization. It lasted until 1941, when Ethiopia regained independence. The country has been plagued by civil wars, famine, and coups. It still remains one of the least free countries on earth, but its sovereignty has never been threatened. After 1941, the case of Liberia is very different. Liberia was founded by the United States in 1821. For the first 17 years, it was a kind of American colony, but it was not a colonized land. Liberia was established by the American Colonization Society. The ACS was run by white people who believed blacks should live in Africa. So they built a separate country for those willing to leave the U.S. The colony quickly grew too expensive to maintain. Thus, it gained full independence as a republic in 1847. Yet the European nations continued to view Liberia as an American colony, so they avoided it. During the scramble for Africa, Liberia has always modeled itself on the United States. Members of the elite never called themselves African. Africans was how they called local tribes. The upper classes identified as Americo-Liberians. Liberia was one of Africa's most developed countries until 1979. After the 1980 coup, it declined rapidly. The consequent civil war destroyed much of Liberia's infrastructure. Today, Ethiopia is ranked 39 out of 55 African countries by Human Development. Liberia is 42nd.